At 35th Junction, someone vanished, and every clue whispers danger. Welcome to the Silent Clueworks. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Comment where you're listening from. Your voices matter. Grateful you're here. Let's begin. It was a Thursday morning in late October when the doorbell rang, and I was in the office trying to convince myself that reorganizing the filing cabinet counted as productive work. The truth was, we needed a client. The bank balance was healthy enough, but Wolfe's appetite for expensive orchids and Fritz's culinary masterpieces had a way of reducing healthy balances to anemic ones with remarkable efficiency. I was contemplating whether to answer the door myself or wait for Fritz when I heard his footsteps in the hall, followed by the murmur of voices. The man Fritz ushered into the office looked like he had been pressed in a suit catalog and then crumpled by a steamroller. His clothes were expensive but wrinkled, his tie was askew, and his hair suggested he had been running his hands through it for several hours. He was carrying a briefcase that he clutched like a life-preserver, and his eyes had the wild look of a man who had seen something that violated the natural order of things. "Mr. Goodwin?" he said, his voice pitched higher than it should have been. "I need to see Nero Wolfe immediately. It's about my partner. He's disappeared." I glanced at the clock. 10:45. Wolfe was still upstairs with his orchids, and prying him away early was like trying to move the Empire State Building with a crowbar. "Mr. Wolfe will be down in 15 minutes, I told him. "I'm Archie Goodwin. You can wait, or you can tell me what happened, and I'll decide if it's worth interrupting his morning routine." The man sat down heavily in the red leather chair. "My name is Gerald Morse," he said. "I'm a structural engineer with Morse & Associates. My partner, David Caro, disappeared yesterday afternoon in the most impossible circumstances imaginable." That got my attention. Wolfe has a weakness for impossible circumstances. They offend his sense of order. Impossible how? Morse opened his briefcase and pulled out a set of blueprints. "We've been working on the new Metropolitan Transit Authority junction at 35th Street. It's a complex project, 3 subway lines converging with a new underground mall and office complex. David was supposed to meet with a city inspector yesterday at 2 o'clock in Section C of the construction site." He spread the blueprints on Wolfe's desk. "This is Section C. It's a finished corridor, 40 feet long, with concrete walls, floor, and ceiling. There's only one entrance, and it leads to a single room at the end. The corridor has no doors, no windows, no vents large enough for a person. It's monitored by security cameras at both ends. I studied the blueprints. It looked like a concrete tube with a room attached. And David entered the corridor at exactly 2:05. The security guards saw him go in. The inspector was waiting in the room. David never arrived. When the inspector came looking for him 10 minutes later, the corridor was empty. David had vanished. Maybe he came back out and the guard missed it." Morse shook his head. "The guard never left his post, and the camera footage shows David entering but never leaving. We've searched every inch of that corridor. There's nowhere to hide, nowhere to go. It's impossible." At 11 o'clock sharp, I heard the elevator descending. Wolfe entered the office with his usual measured pace, settled into his chair behind the desk, and rang for beer. He glanced at the blueprints, then at Morse, then at me. "Archie." "Mr. Gerald Morse," I said. "His partner disappeared yesterday in what he claims are impossible circumstances." Wolfe's eyebrows went up a fraction. "Impossible." Morse repeated his story, adding details. David Caro had been carrying a briefcase containing financial documents related to the junction project. There had been rumors of cost overruns and irregularities in the billing. David had been investigating quietly because he suspected someone was skimming money from the construction budget. The meeting with the inspector was supposed to be the handoff of evidence that would expose the scheme. "The inspector was legitimate?" Wolfe asked. "We verified his credentials. The meeting was arranged through proper channels. But when David didn't show up, the inspector left." An hour later, we got an anonymous call saying that if we wanted David back alive, we should forget about the financial irregularities and keep our mouths shut. Wolfe poured beer from the bottle Fritz had brought, creating the perfect head with practiced precision. He studied the blueprints while he drank. "You've examined the corridor personally." 3 times. With the police, with our own security team, and with a structural engineer from another firm. There's no secret passage, no hidden door, no way out except the way he went in. The cameras show him entering at 2:05 and never leaving. The timestamp is accurate. The footage is continuous, no gaps or edits. Wolfe set down his glass and leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Morse, men do not vanish into thin air. If your partner entered that corridor and did not emerge, then either your facts are wrong or your understanding of them is incomplete." "That's why I'm here," Morse said. "I need someone who can see what we're missing. The police think David ran off with the money himself, but I know better. Someone has taken him, and they're using his disappearance to cover up their own crimes." Wolfe closed his eyes and sat silent for a long moment. When he opened them, he was looking at Morse with the expression he reserves for puzzles that have personally insulted him. "Your fee?" Morse named a figure that would keep us comfortable for months. Wolfe nodded once. "Very well. Archie will need to examine this corridor immediately. I assume it's still sealed." "The police released it this morning, but we've kept it locked down." "Good. Archie, get your coat. I want a complete report on the physical impossibility of Mr. Caro's disappearance. If someone has found a way to make a man vanish from a concrete tube, I intend to discover how they did it." I stood up, already reaching for my hat. Another case, another puzzle, and another chance to watch Wolfe prove that the impossible was merely the improbable wearing a disguise. The man from 35th Junction was missing, but something told me we were going to find him, along with whoever thought they were clever enough to fool Nero Wolfe. The construction site at 35th Street was a monument to organized chaos, the kind of place where millions of dollars worth of steel and concrete were being persuaded into becoming something useful through the application of noise, sweat, and creative profanity. Morse met me at the security gate with a yellow hard hat that made me look like a canary with delusions of grandeur, and we descended through 3 levels of increasingly finished construction until we reached Section C. The transformation from raw construction to completed work was dramatic. The upper levels showed exposed wiring and unpainted drywall, but by the time we reached the bottom, everything looked ready for occupancy. Polished concrete floors, smooth walls painted institutional beige, and overhead lighting that gave everything the sterile glow of a government office. Standing outside a heavy steel door marked C7 was a security guard who looked like he had been carved from a tree trunk and then taught to wear a uniform. "This is Leo Kovich," Morse said. "Site foreman. He was here when David disappeared." Kovich looked at me with the kind of expression usually reserved for tax auditors and people who ask for directions to New Jersey. He was short, wide, and wearing a vest that was fighting a losing battle against his chest. When he spoke, his voice sounded like gravel being mixed in a cement truck. "Police already wasted 3 hours of my time," he said. "I got a schedule to keep, regardless of who decides to play hide-and-seek." "You were standing right here when Caro went in?" I asked. Kovich nodded and spat on the ground near my left shoe, arguing with a supplier on the radio. "Nobody came out of that tunnel except the inspector, screaming about being stood up." He unlocked the steel door and swung it open. I stepped into the impossible corridor, and it was exactly as disappointing as I had expected. 40 feet of featureless concrete tube, 8 feet wide, 10 feet high, with nothing to break the smooth surfaces except the light fixtures overhead. The lighting was harsh fluorescent, leaving no shadows deep enough to hide a mouse, let alone a grown man. I walked the length slowly, running my hands along the walls. Solid concrete, no hollow spots, no panels that might conceal anything more interesting than my reflection. At the far end, the corridor opened into a square room where a thin, balding man in a cheap suit was sweating despite the cool underground air. Morse introduced him as Inspector Harold Vance, and he looked at me with the desperate eyes of a man who knows he's the prime suspect in a magic trick he did not perform. "Walk me through it," I said. Vance's voice shook like a paint mixer. I arrived at 2 o'clock, came straight to this room, sat down to wait, had the papers ready, everything organized. I waited 10 minutes, then 20. Finally got angry and went back to ask the guard where Caro was. That's when they told me he'd gone in 5 minutes after I did. "You never saw him? Never heard footsteps?" "Nothing. The room's insulated from the construction noise. I heard nothing but the ventilation hum." I examined the security camera mounted above the entrance door, then walked back to check the second camera in the room. Standard commercial equipment, the kind that records everything to a digital system. I need to see the footage. Back in the site office, a trailer crammed with desks and blueprints, Morse pulled out a tablet and queued up the security recording. The timestamp read 2:03 p.m., showing an empty corridor from entrance to exit. At 2:05 and 17 seconds, David Caro entered the frame. Tall man, dark suit, leather briefcase, walking with confident purpose down the corridor until he reached the halfway point. Then he stopped, his head turning slightly as if he had heard something. He stood there for perhaps 5 seconds, took 2 more steps forward, and then, between one frame and the next, he was gone. Not walking out of frame, not ducking or jumping, simply erased from existence. One frame showed him standing there, the next showed empty concrete. "Play that again," I said. Morse rewound it 3 times. The result was identical. Caro disappeared between frames with no blur of motion, no indication of where he had gone. The timestamp was continuous, the file metadata clean according to 3 different experts who had examined it for tampering. "The police think it's been edited," Morse said, "but there's no evidence of manipulation, no missing frames, no digital artifacts." I switched to the second camera feed showing Inspector Vance in the room. At 2:06, he stood up and walked to the corridor door, looking down the empty passage with obvious puzzlement. He waited, returned to his seat, and at 2:15 left through the storage room door. While I was absorbing this impossibility, the sound of high heels on concrete announced another player. She came clicking down the corridor wearing a hard hat that looked like a fashion accessory. Tall, blonde, and radiating the kind of cool efficiency that calculates your net worth in nanoseconds. Morse introduced her as Elena Rostova, liaison for the Development Corporation. "The investors are getting jittery about the police presence," she told Morse. "This stunt needs to end." "What stunt?" I asked. She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "David Caro has been threatening to blow the whistle on non-existent problems for months. I suspect he staged this disappearance for leverage in contract negotiations. Where does a man hide in a 40-foot concrete tube?" She shrugged with practiced indifference. "That's your problem, but if you don't solve it soon, I'll have this site cleared and work resumed by Monday, missing person or not." I walked back to the corridor for one final examination, this time focusing on details I might have missed. Near the base of the wall where floor met concrete, I noticed a faint discoloration, a slightly darker patch maybe 3 inches long. I knelt and touched it. Oil. Very thin, very faint, but definitely synthetic lubricant. I rubbed it between my fingers, smelled it, then wiped my hand clean without mentioning the discovery to my audience. The drive back to the brownstone gave me time to arrange the facts. A man walks into a concrete tube with perfect camera coverage and vanishes between video frames. 3 witnesses, each with their own version of events and their own reasons to lie. A threatening phone call demanding silence about financial irregularities, and a small oil stain that suggested someone had been very careful about moving something heavy and mechanical in that corridor. When I walked into the office, Wolfe was at his desk with his second bottle of beer, looking at me with half-closed eyes. He didn't ask how it went. He just waited, motionless as a mountain that had learned patience. I sat down, swiveled to face him, and grinned. It's a beauty, boss, a solid concrete throat with a camera down its gullet. David Caro walked in, the world swallowed him, and nobody burped, but I found a grease stain. Met 3 people who are lying about something, and watched a man disappear from a video recording that 3 experts swear hasn't been tampered with. Wolfe's lips twitched in what passed for his version of a smile. He set down his glass and said, "Report." And I began to talk. I gave it to him straight, every detail from the yellow hard hat to Elena Rostova's dismissive arrogance. Wolfe sat motionless through my recitation, eyes closed, fingers interlaced across his middle. When I described the impossible disappearance on camera, his eyebrows twitched. When I mentioned the oil stain, he opened his eyes and reached for his beer. "The location of this mark," he said. "Precisely. About 25 feet from the entrance, 6 inches from the right wall, maybe 3 inches long, 1/4 inch wide. Fresh synthetic oil, the kind used in hydraulic systems. Still slightly tacky when I touched it." Wolfe poured beer with his usual precision, creating the perfect head. "You examined the terminal room thoroughly?" I had to admit I had given it only a cursory inspection, being more fascinated by the impossible corridor. His grunt conveyed his opinion of that oversight with eloquent economy. "The cameras showed no one entering before Mr. Caro except Inspector Vance?" "Correct. Vance at 2 o'clock, Caro at 2:05. The footage is continuous, no gaps, no evidence of tampering according to 3 experts. Yet Mr. Caro vanished between frames." Wolfe drank slowly, his eyes focused on something beyond the office walls. "At 30 frames per second, that represents a duration of less than 1/30th of a second. Faster than human perception. Certainly faster than normal human movement. If the recording is genuine, then either Mr. Caro achieved impossible velocity, or something occurred that the camera was designed not to record properly." "A magic trick," I said. "The oil suggests machinery. A sliding panel, false wall, trap door. But it would have to move fast enough to fool the camera, and quietly enough not to alert Inspector Vance in the adjacent room." Wolfe set down his glass. "This was a prepared environment, Archie. That corridor was constructed specifically for this purpose. Someone invested considerable resources in creating a facility capable of making a man disappear on command." The phone rang before I could respond. It was Gerald Morse, and his voice carried the kind of strain that suggested bad news had arrived by special delivery. "Mr. Goodwin, I need to bring something to Mr. Wolfe immediately. We've received a package." "What kind of package?" "David's wedding ring and a photograph. Can I come now?" I covered the mouthpiece and relayed this to Wolfe, who nodded once. "Tell him to come immediately. Handle nothing more than absolutely necessary." Morse arrived within the hour, looking like he had aged a decade since morning. He carried a manila envelope with gloved hands, setting it on Wolfe's desk as if it contained explosives. Inside was David Caro's gold wedding band and a Polaroid photograph, showing him bound to a chair in what appeared to be a basement or warehouse. His face was bruised, his shirt torn, and he was holding that day's newspaper to establish the photograph's currency. A typed note on plain paper accompanied the evidence. "Stop the investigation, or the next package contains more than jewelry. 24 hours to choose between your partner's life and your curiosity about missing money." Wolfe examined the ring through his magnifying glass, then studied the photograph with methodical attention. "This ring is genuine?" Morse's voice broke. "David never removed it. Not once in 15 years of marriage. After his wife died, he said wearing it kept her memory close." Wolfe nodded and returned to the photograph. "Observe the lighting, Archie. The shadows fall from the upper left, but there is no visible light source in that direction. The background is deliberately darkened, suggesting controlled illumination. Also, examine the rope binding his wrists. I took the magnifying glass and studied the image. The knots are precise, symmetrical. Professional work. Indeed, whoever bound Mr. Caro possesses either military training or extensive maritime experience. The rope itself appears to be standard nylon cord, available at any hardware store, but the technique reveals expertise. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. This photograph tells us several things. Mr. Caro is alive. He's being held in a controlled environment with artificial lighting, and his captor has specific technical skills. The newspaper proves it was taken today, I added. Yes, but notice something else. The paper is folded to display the headline, but the crease is sharp, deliberate. This was arranged for the photograph, not casual reading. Our correspondent is methodical, careful about details. The phone rang again. This time it was Inspector Harold Vance, his voice pitched high with anxiety. Mr. Goodwin, I must speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately. I've been threatened. Someone knows I was at the construction site, and they're saying I'll be next if I continue cooperating with investigators. I put him on hold and looked at Wolfe, who considered for a moment before nodding. Tell him to come here tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and Archie, when he arrives, observe his hands carefully. After I arranged the meeting with Vance, Wolfe reached for the phone himself, an unusual breach of his normal protocol. I'm calling Saul. We require background investigations immediately. Saul Panzer answered on the second ring, and Wolfe's instructions were characteristically precise. Saul, I need complete histories on 3 individuals. Elena Rostova, the liaison for 35th Junction Properties. Learn when she arrived in New York, her previous employment, who recommended her, and the terms of her engagement. Second, Inspector Harold Vance. Financial background, employment history, any irregularities in his inspection records. Third, the Development Corporation itself and its parent company, Northline Capital. Officers, shareholders, legal counsel, and any litigation. When he hung up, I was already reaching for my hat. You want me back at the construction site? No, the site office will contain only official records. I want the unofficial ones. Find the subcontractors who actually built Section C, concrete work, electrical installation, security systems. If that corridor is a machine, someone constructed it according to specific plans. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the Hall of Records, navigating the bureaucratic maze of permits and filings. The concrete work for Section C had been contracted to Foundational Solidities, which traced through 3 shell companies to a parent firm called Kovich Construction. Our territorial foreman wasn't just an employee. He was part owner of the company that had poured the concrete for his own tunnel. The electrical work had been subcontracted to Metropolitan Systems, another shell company that led back to the same network of holding corporations. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to obscure the true ownership of the companies that built the infrastructure for David Caro's disappearance. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office with his second bottle of beer, examining the blueprints Morse had provided. I spread my findings on his desk, the permit applications, the corporate filings, the tangled web of shell companies that all led back to a core group of investors. Kovich Construction built the corridor, I reported. The same Leo Kovich who was standing guard when Caro disappeared. The electrical work was done by another company in the same ownership network. Someone spent serious money creating a legitimate-looking paper trail for what amounts to a custom-built disappearing chamber. Wolfe studied the documents with growing interest. The investment is substantial. This was not a spontaneous crime of opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated operation months in the making. Someone anticipated the need to make David Caro vanish and prepared accordingly. The question is whether they built the trap for Caro specifically, or if he just happened to stumble into something that was already there. An excellent question. Wolfe closed his eyes and sat silent for several minutes. When he opened them, his expression had the focused intensity he reserved for problems that had personally offended him. Tomorrow morning, after we interview Inspector Vance, you will return to that construction site with Saul. I want precise measurements of every surface in that corridor, photographs from multiple angles, and samples of that oil stain for analysis. I also want the complete employment records of every person who had access to Section C during its construction. And if they refuse to cooperate? Wolfe's smile was thin and predatory. They have threatened us, Archie. They have kidnapped a man and demanded our silence. They have made the error of believing that Nero Wolfe can be intimidated by anonymous telephone calls and theatrical gestures. Tomorrow, we begin to demonstrate the futility of that assumption. The evening passed quietly, but it was the kind of quiet that precedes storms. Over dinner, Fritz mentioned that someone had called asking whether Mr. Wolfe was accepting new clients, then hung up when Fritz began to take a message. During coffee, I noticed a car parked across the street that hadn't been there earlier, with someone sitting in the driver's seat. "We're being watched," I told Wolfe as he prepared to retire to his room. He paused at the bottom of the stairs. "Of course we are. They know we have 24 hours to decide Mr. Caro's fate. They want to ensure we make the correct choice." His smile was glacial. "They will be disappointed." As I locked up for the night, I reflected on the day's discoveries. We had a man who vanished impossibly, a corridor built by conspirators, physical evidence that proved careful planning, and threats that revealed desperation. Most importantly, we had Nero Wolfe's personal investment in proving that the impossible was merely the improbable wearing an expensive disguise. Tomorrow would bring Inspector Vance, with his nervous hands and his convenient presence at the scene. It would bring another visit to the construction site, this time with Saul's methodical assistance. And somewhere in the city, David Caro was waiting in a basement, bound with expert knots, while his captors counted the hours until their deadline. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, already planning the questions I would ask Vance in the morning. In Nero Wolfe mysteries, the impossible always had an explanation. The trick was finding it before the magicians decided to make their audience disappear as well. Inspector Harold Vance arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, which told me he was either naturally punctual or scared enough to be early. He sat in the red leather chair with his briefcase balanced on his knees and his eyes doing nervous reconnaissance of the room. I'd been watching him for 10 minutes when Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at 11, settled behind his desk, and rang for beer. Wolfe studied Vance with the kind of attention usually reserved for specimens under glass. When Fritz had delivered the tray and departed, Wolfe poured slowly, creating his customary perfect head. "Mr. Vance," he said finally, "you are frightened. The question is whether you fear the people who abducted Mr. Caro, or whether you fear the consequences of your own compromised position being discovered." Vance's face went pale. "I don't understand what you mean." "Your hands," Wolfe observed mildly. "Mr. Goodwin has been watching them. No rope burns, no calluses suggesting familiarity with knots, but a distinct tremor that suggests either medical condition or extreme stress. Your watch is expensive. Your suit is not. Your shoes are well maintained but old. The profile suggests a man living beyond his means or a man who has recently experienced financial pressure." The silence stretched until Vance sagged in his chair. "I owe money," he said quietly. "Gambling. I got in deep with the wrong people. And Leo Kovich bought my debt 6 weeks ago. He said he'd wipe the slate clean if I did one simple favor." "Schedule the inspection for 2 o'clock and wait in the terminal room," Wolfe said. It was not a question. Vance nodded miserably. He said Caro might not show up, that he was getting cold feet about his accusations. My job was just to be the witness that he never arrived. I swear I didn't know they were planning to snatch him. I thought it was just intimidation, making him look unreliable. Wolfe's expression was glacial. "You were the anchor point, Mr. Vance. Your presence in that room ensured Mr. Caro had no legitimate exit from his commitment to expose the fraud. Whether you intended it or not, you are an accessory to kidnapping." After Vance departed, looking like a man who had just watched his career dissolve, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence. When Saul Panzer arrived 20 minutes later, Wolfe was ready with instructions. "What have you learned about our cast of characters?" Wolfe asked. Saul opened his folder with characteristic precision. Elena Rostova arrived in New York 18 months ago from Chicago, where she worked for Northline Capital's Midwest Division. Her contract for the 35th Junction project is unusual. Instead of salary, she receives performance bonuses tied to cost savings. If the project comes in significantly under budget, she stands to make nearly $500,000. "Financial incentive for creative accounting," I observed. "Leo Kovic is more desperate than greedy," Saul continued. "Kovic Construction has been struggling. 3 major contracts cancelled in 2 years, credit rating declining steadily. The 35th Junction project represents their largest contract in a decade. If it fails, the company goes bankrupt." Wolfe absorbed this information. Desperation and greed, both powerful motivators. What of the parent corporation? Northline Capital is deliberately opaque. Multiple layers of holding companies and trusts, all leading back to a Delaware corporation with sealed ownership records. Their legal counsel is Whitman, Burke and Associates, a firm known for aggressive representation and creative interpretation of regulations. "Archie," Wolfe said, "you and Saul will return to Section C immediately. I want complete documentation, measurements, photographs and samples of any unusual substances. If that corridor contains hidden machinery, there will be evidence of its operation." We took a taxi to 35th Street, where the construction site buzzed with unusual activity. Workers were moving equipment with hurried efficiency, and the security presence had doubled. We found Leo Kovic in the site office, glaring at blueprints with the intensity of a man trying to will them into compliance. "We need access to Section C again," I told him. "Complete access, with privacy, while we work." Kovic's face darkened. "I got schedules to maintain. That section needs certification by Monday or the whole project falls behind." "Then you'd better hope we find what we're looking for quickly," I replied. "Because if David Caro doesn't turn up alive, this entire site becomes a crime scene." He stared at me for a long moment, then spat into a wastebasket and jerked his head toward the door. 2 hours. After that, I'm locking it down." We descended to Section C with our equipment. Saul carried a professional laser measuring device and a tackle box full of investigation tools. The corridor looked identical to yesterday, but I noticed the oil stain had been scrubbed clean. Someone had been busy. "Start at the entrance," I told Saul. "Every 6 inches. I want a topology of this tube down to the millimeter." Saul worked methodically, the red dot of his laser dancing over the concrete surfaces. I focused on the area where the oil stain had been, tapping the walls with my pocket knife. Solid concrete, uniform sound, until I reached a point approximately 25 feet from the entrance. The pitch changed subtly, becoming tighter, more resonant. "Saul, bring the laser here." We measured the corridor width at the entrance, exactly 8 feet. At the point where Caro had vanished, 8 feet and 1/4 inch. The variance was so slight the eye couldn't detect it, but the laser didn't lie. "The wall bows out slightly right here," Saul observed, running his hand along the surface. I knelt and examined the seam where floor met wall. Almost invisible, a hairline crack filled with dust and debris. When I pressed my knife blade into it, it didn't hit concrete. It hit rubber. A seal. I looked up at the ceiling. The light fixtures were evenly spaced except for one directly above us, which was slightly askew. The pieces clicked into place with almost audible precision. "It's not a trap door," I said quietly. "It's a rotating section, a piece of the wall, maybe 4 feet wide, mounted on a central pivot. It spins like a revolving door. Saul nodded slowly. Caro steps here. Someone triggers the mechanism, and the wall rotates him into the service space behind, while simultaneously rotating a blank section into place. The whole operation takes less than a second. Fast enough to happen between camera frames, I agreed, and the hydraulic system would be nearly silent if properly maintained. We spent another hour documenting everything. Photographs from multiple angles, precise measurements, samples of the rubber seal material. When we finally emerged from the tunnel, Leo Kovic was waiting with Elena Rostova and two men in expensive suits who had the unmistakable bearing of corporate security. "Gentlemen," Rostova said with Arctic politeness, "I trust your investigation was productive. However, I must inform you that your access to this site has been revoked pending review by our legal department." "On whose authority?" I asked. "Mine," said the taller of the two suits, "Charles Whitman, representing Northline Capital. Any further trespassing will result in criminal charges." As we walked back to the street, Saul murmured, "They're scared, moving fast, making mistakes. That's when people get dangerous." I nodded, thinking of David Caro bound in some basement, of the deadline approaching, of Nero Wolfe sitting in his chair with his eyes closed, arranging the pieces of an increasingly complex puzzle. We had found the mechanism, but we were still missing the most important element, where they had taken their victim and whether we could reach him before the deadline expired. The game was accelerating, and the stakes were rising. In 12 hours, someone would have to make a choice that would determine whether David Caro lived or died. I suspected Nero Wolfe already knew what that choice would be, and who would be making it. When we returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk studying the blueprints Morse had provided, comparing them against a city survey map spread beside them. He listened to our report without interruption, his eyes moving between the photographs Saul had taken and the precise measurements we had documented. When I finished describing the rotating wall mechanism, he leaned back and interlaced his fingers across his middle. "Elegant and expensive," he murmured. "The hydraulic system alone would require specialized engineering, not to mention the precision required to maintain the illusion of solid concrete. This was not improvised, Archie. Someone invested considerable resources in creating a facility specifically designed to make David Caro disappear." Saul spread his additional findings across the desk. "The shell company network is more extensive than we initially discovered. Kovic Construction is connected to at least 6 other entities, all tracing back through holding companies to Northline Capital. But here's what's interesting. They've been leasing basement and sub-basement space in older buildings throughout the district, all within a half-mile radius of the Junction project." Wolfe examined Saul's documentation with growing interest. "Storage facilities?" "Officially, yes, but the lease terms are unusual. Short duration, high security deposits, and specific clauses about soundproofing and climate control. Most are listed as empty, but utility records show regular electrical usage. A network of prepared locations," Wolfe concluded. "They have created multiple options for concealing evidence, storing materials, or housing unwilling guests. The rotating wall was merely the initial capture mechanism. Mr. Caro was transferred elsewhere immediately." The phone rang, interrupting his analysis. I answered and found myself listening to Gerald Morse, whose voice had acquired the brittle quality of a man operating on his last reserves of composure. "They've sent another video," he said without preamble. "David reading a statement, a confession that he fabricated the financial irregularities and fled the country to avoid prosecution. They want me to release it to the media within the hour, or they'll send his body to his daughter." "Bring the video immediately," Wolfe instructed. "Touch nothing else. Speak to no one else." While we waited for Morse, Wolfe turned to Saul. "Continue your investigation of the leased properties. I want locations, access points, and any unusual modifications to the original structures. pay particular attention to buildings with basement connections to utility tunnels or abandoned infrastructure. Morse arrived within 20 minutes, carrying a tablet computer with hands that shook visibly. We gathered around his desk as he played the video file. David Caro sat in the same chair as the photograph, looking exhausted but unharmed. He read from a prepared script in a monotone voice, admitting to fabricating evidence and claiming he had left the country voluntarily. Wolfe watched the video 3 times, his attention focused not on Caro's words, but on the background details. The lighting remains controlled, but observe the slight vibration in the image. The camera is mounted on something that transmits mechanical vibration. Also, listen carefully to the ambient sound. I replayed the audio with the volume increased. Beneath Caro's voice was a low, rhythmic thumping, barely audible but regular. "Heavy machinery," I said. "Something large and mechanical." "The frequency suggests pile driving equipment," Wolfe observed, "but muffled by distance and intervening structure. Saul, which of the leased properties are adjacent to active construction sites?" Saul consulted his notes. 3 possibilities, but one stands out. A basement storage facility directly beneath the North Line Capital Annex project. 2 blocks from the Junction site. The lease was signed 8 months ago, just after Section C was completed. Wolfe's eyes opened fully. Of course, they didn't transport him across the city. They moved him next door. The rotating wall connects to existing infrastructure, probably the old utility tunnels which lead directly to their own secondary facility. The phone rang again. This time the voice was electronically distorted, gender and accent obscured by digital processing. "Mr. Wolfe, your investigation ends now. We know you discovered our mechanism. We know you have been asking questions about our properties. This is your final warning. Withdraw completely, or David Caro dies tonight." Wolfe's response was ice cold. "I do not negotiate with kidnappers, and I do not respond to threats. If you harm Mr. Caro, you will face consequences that extend far beyond your current legal difficulties. I suggest you reconsider your position." The line went dead. Wolfe set down the phone with deliberate precision and looked at Morse, who had gone pale during the exchange. "Mr. Morse," Wolfe said calmly, "they are frightened. The electronic voice distortion, the escalating threats, the demand for immediate capitulation. These are the actions of people who have lost control of their carefully planned operation. Fear makes men dangerous, but it also makes them careless." "What do you want me to do?" Morse asked. "You will do exactly what they have demanded," Wolfe replied, "with one modification. You will release the video to the media, but you will also schedule a press conference for 8 o'clock this evening. At that conference, you will announce that new evidence in the financial irregularities case will be presented to federal prosecutors tomorrow morning." I stared at him. "That's the opposite of what they want." "Precisely. We are going to force them to act, Archie. They cannot allow Mr. Morse to present evidence that contradicts their fabricated confession. They will be compelled to produce David Caro immediately to refute it or to silence him permanently before he can contradict their narrative." Saul nodded slowly. "You're turning their deadline against them. I am demonstrating that their carefully constructed plan has a fatal flaw," Wolfe said. "They assumed they could control the narrative through intimidation and fabricated evidence. They did not anticipate resistance, and they certainly did not prepare for someone who refuses to be manipulated." He turned to me. "Archie, you will coordinate with Saul to establish surveillance on the annex building. If they move Mr. Caro tonight, we must be prepared to intervene. But do nothing precipitous. They are desperate now, which makes them unpredictable." As Morse departed to arrange his press conference, looking like a man walking to his own execution, I reflected on Wolfe's strategy. We had identified their mechanism, located their probable hiding place, and now we were forcing them to act within our timeline rather than theirs. The midnight deadline they had imposed was meaningless now. They would have to respond to Morse's press conference announcement within hours, not because they wanted to, but because their own deception required it. The game was accelerating toward its conclusion, and Nero Wolfe was orchestrating every move from his chair behind the desk. In 3 hours, someone would have to make a choice that would determine not only David Caro's fate, but the exposure of a conspiracy that had been months in the making. I suspected Wolfe already knew exactly how that choice would unfold, and who would be making it. Outside, the October evening was settling into darkness. Soon the final act would begin, and we would discover whether Wolfe's gambit would save David Caro or precipitate the very tragedy we were trying to prevent. Either way, the waiting was almost over. By 7 that evening, Saul and I were positioned in a rented sedan across from the North Line Capitol Annex building, armed with coffee, binoculars, and the kind of patience that surveillance work demands. The building was a converted warehouse from the 1920s, 4 stories of weathered brick with windows that had been painted black from the inside. According to the city records Saul had pulled, the basement extended 2 levels below street grade, connecting to the old utility tunnel system that ran beneath this section of Manhattan like arteries in a body. 3 exits, Saul observed, sketching the building layout on a notepad. Main entrance on 34th Street, loading dock on the west side, and a service door facing the alley. If they move Caro tonight, it'll be through the dock, vehicle access, and no street visibility. I focused my binoculars on the upper floors. Most windows were dark, but the 3rd floor showed the dim glow of security lighting. The loading dock was secured with a heavy chain, but fresh tire marks in the accumulated grime suggested recent use. At 7:15, I tuned the car radio to the local news station and waited for Gerald Morse's press conference to begin. Morse's voice came through the static at exactly 8 o'clock, thin but determined as he read the statement Wolfe had prepared. He announced that tomorrow morning he would present irrefutable evidence of systematic billing fraud to federal prosecutors, evidence compiled by his missing partner before his disappearance. He didn't mention the kidnapping or the threats, just promised that justice was coming with the sunrise. "That's the bell," I murmured. "Now we see how fast they dance." The reaction was immediate and violent. At 8:07, a black Lincoln sedan came screaming around the corner, tires squealing as it swerved into the alley beside the annex. Leo Kovich emerged from the driver's side, his bulk unmistakable even in the dim streetlight. Charles Whitman climbed out of the passenger seat, moving with the nervous energy of a man who had just watched his carefully constructed world begin to collapse. They disappeared through the service door, and 3 minutes later, Elena Rostova arrived in a silver Mercedes, parking with the precision of someone who had done this before. She entered through the main entrance, carrying herself with the kind of rigid composure that suggested panic held firmly in check. I reached for the car phone and dialed the brownstone. Wolfe answered on the first ring, as if he had been sitting with his hand on the receiver. "The principals have arrived," I reported. "Kovich, Whitman, and Rostova. They're all inside the annex building." "Excellent." Wolfe's voice carried the satisfaction of a chess master watching his opponent walk into checkmate. "They are reacting exactly as predicted. Fear has driven them to consolidate, which means they will make their critical error within the next 20 minutes. "What kind of error?" "They will attempt to relocate Mr. Caro to what they perceive as a more secure location. They cannot risk leaving him where we have identified his presence, and they cannot allow the police to find him before they have neutralized the threat he represents. They are trapped between equally unacceptable alternatives." As if summoned by Wolfe's prediction, a white panel van turned into the alley at 8:20, backing up to the loading dock with its headlights off. The driver kept the engine running while 2 men in work clothes began removing the chain from the dock doors. "Transport has arrived," I told Wolfe. "They're moving him." "Of course they are. Archie, you will intercept them before they can leave the immediate area. Offer Mr. Whitman a choice. He can bring Mr. Caro to my office immediately for a civilized discussion of terms, or he can explain to a homicide detective why his client's fingerprints are on the hydraulic controls of a kidnapping mechanism. I suspect he will choose the former. What if he calls my bluff? It is not a bluff. Saul photographed those controls yesterday, and I've already prepared a complete analysis of the rotating wall mechanism for Inspector Kramer. The only question is whether Mr. Whitman receives 12 hours to arrange his affairs, or whether he spends tonight in a holding cell. The loading dock doors rolled up, spilling yellow light into the alley. Kovich and another man appeared, supporting a figure between them. David Caro, walking but unsteady, his head covered with a dark hood. They moved him toward the van with practiced efficiency. I started our engine. Time to crash the party. Saul checked his pistol, a reflex born of long experience. Remember what Wolfe said about violence? I remember. But they don't know we're not planning to shoot anybody. We pulled out of our parking space and drove slowly to the mouth of the alley, where I stopped the sedan directly across the opening, blocking the only exit. Our headlights washed over the loading scene, freezing everyone in harsh white light. Kovich's hand moved toward his jacket, but Saul was already out of the car, his weapon resting casually on the roof. I stepped out, keeping my hands visible but ready. Good evening, gentlemen. Lovely night for moving furniture. Whitman stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. This is harassment, Goodwin. I'll have your license revoked. I'll have you arrested for obstruction of justice. Save the closing arguments, Counselor, I said, walking toward them until I was close enough to see the sweat on Whitman's forehead. The game is over. Nero Wolfe knows about your rotating wall. He knows about the hydraulic system, the oil traces, the utility tunnel connections. Right now, he's deciding whether to call Inspector Kramer with the complete evidence package or to give you one last chance to end this without additional felony charges. Kovich snarled. I say we take them. 2 against 4, and we got the advantage. Saul doesn't miss, I said pleasantly, and I'm having a bad day. But Mr. Wolfe is feeling generous. He's offering you a trade. Bring Caro to the brownstone right now. Sit down like civilized people and work something out. Do that, and the police don't get the evidence until tomorrow morning. You have 12 hours to spin your story or book passage to somewhere without extradition treaties. Whitman stared at me, his lawyer's mind calculating odds and alternatives. He looked at Caro swaying between his captors, at Kovich's desperate fury, at the gun in Saul's steady hand. He was trapped, and he knew it. What guarantee do we have? Whitman asked finally. Nero Wolfe's word, I said, which is worth more than your client's entire net worth. You know his reputation, Counselor. When he makes a deal, he keeps it. The silence stretched for 30 seconds while Whitman weighed his options. Finally, he turned to Kovich. Remove the hood. Put him in the van properly. We're going to 35th Street. You're insane, Kovich spat. Wolfe will serve us up on a platter. We're already cooked, Whitman snapped, his composure finally cracking. They know about the mechanism, Leo. It's over. The only question now is whether we negotiate surrender or wait for the SWAT team. It took 10 minutes to organize the convoy. David Caro rode in the van's passenger seat, alert and unbound. Kovich drove with the resignation of a man who had run out of alternatives. Whitman sat in the back, probably composing his opening statement. Saul and I followed in our sedan, and behind us came Elena Rostova in her Mercedes, having been summoned by a phone call from Wolfe that I suspected had been both brief and persuasive. As we turned onto West 35th Street, I could see the brownstone waiting, every window blazing with light. Fritz would have prepared the office for what Wolfe called a gathering, arranging chairs for maximum psychological effect. In a few minutes, Nero Wolfe would demonstrate why he was the most dangerous man in New York to cross, armed with nothing more lethal than his intellect and an unlimited capacity for patience. I parked behind the van and got out to escort our guests. The impossible disappearance was about to become an inevitable confession, and I had a front-row seat for the performance. It was going to be a very interesting evening. Fritz had transformed the office into a theater of judgment with his usual understated efficiency. The chairs were arranged in a precise semicircle facing Wolfe's desk, each positioned to maximize the psychological impact of being scrutinized by the master detective. Wolfe sat behind his desk like a mountain that had learned patience, the beer tray positioned within easy reach, his eyes half closed, but missing nothing. I brought them in with careful choreography. David Caro entered first, still shaky but alert, his face bearing the bruises of captivity but his eyes clear with the satisfaction of survival. Gerald Morse followed, gripping his partner's shoulder with protective intensity. Then came the conspirators. Charles Whitman attempting to project legal authority despite his circumstances. Elena Rostova maintaining her brittle composure like armor, and Leokovich looking like a cornered bear searching for an exit that didn't involve prison bars. Saul took his position near the bookshelves, arms folded, expression neutral. I settled at my desk with notebook ready, prepared to record what promised to be a comprehensive dismantling of an elaborate criminal conspiracy. The silence stretched until it became physically uncomfortable, broken only by Wolfe pouring beer with his customary precision. "We are assembled," Wolfe began, his voice carrying the authority of a judge opening court, "to discuss a conspiracy involving kidnapping, fraud, and the systematic theft of public funds." The scheme was elegant in conception, sophisticated in execution, and doomed by the fundamental flaw that afflicts all criminal enterprises, the belief that intelligence can substitute for morality. He paused, allowing his words to settle. "Mr. Caro, before we proceed, confirm for the record that you discovered financial irregularities in the 35th Junction project approximately 6 months ago." Caro cleared his throat. "Invoices for materials that were never delivered. Labor costs that didn't match actual crew sizes. Equipment rentals billed at triple market rates. Someone was systematically inflating costs and pocketing the difference. The total was approaching $12 million. $12 million, Wolfe repeated, his gaze moving across the assembled faces. A substantial sum even for a project of this magnitude. Mr. Whitman, as legal counsel for Northline Capital, you were aware of Mr. Caro's investigation. Whitman shifted uncomfortably. My client reported some concerns about cost overruns, but nothing that suggested criminal activity. Nothing except the rotating wall mechanism you authorized for Section C, Wolfe said calmly. A device that required specialized engineering, hydraulic systems, and precise timing to operate effectively. The blueprints, which Mr. Panzer retrieved from Mr. Caro's safety deposit box, show your initials on the modification orders. You didn't build that mechanism for structural purposes, Mr. Whitman. You built it to make people disappear. Wolfe turned to Kovich. Your company constructed the device, a section of corridor wall mounted on a central pivot, operated by hydraulic pressure, capable of rotating a man from public view into a service tunnel in less than 1/30th of a second. Faster than human perception, certainly faster than the security cameras were designed to record. Your fingerprints are on the control mechanism, Mr. Kovich. The oil residue from the hydraulic system is still present despite your attempts to clean it. Kovich's face darkened. You can't prove I operated anything. On the contrary, Wolfe replied. The mechanism requires regular maintenance. The access panel bears your fingerprints, photographed in high resolution by Mr. Panzer. More importantly, your company's financial records show cash withdrawals, corresponding exactly to the dates when additional workers would have been needed to operate the device and transport Mr. Caro to his place of confinement. Elena Rostova spoke for the first time, her voice tight with controlled anger. This is elaborate speculation, Mr. Wolfe. You have no direct evidence connecting any of us to Mr. Caro's disappearance. Miss Rostova, Wolfe said, his tone acquiring an edge, your performance bonus contract with Northline Capital was contingent upon bringing the project in significantly under budget. Mr. Caro's investigation threatened not only those bonuses, but your entire career trajectory. Saul's inquiries revealed that your previous position in Chicago ended abruptly after an internal audit discovered similar cost manipulation schemes. Rostova's composure cracked slightly. Those charges were never filed. The audit found no evidence of wrongdoing. Because you had learned to be more subtle, Wolfe continued. Here in New York, instead of simple embezzlement, you orchestrated a sophisticated laundering operation. Funds moved from the construction budget through shell companies controlled by Northline Capital, then returned as investments in the very contractors performing the work. The money circulated in a closed loop, with each transaction generating legitimate appearing documentation while the principals skimmed substantial percentages. Whitman leaned forward. Mr. Wolfe, let's discuss terms. My clients are prepared to negotiate a settlement that addresses Mr. Caro's concerns without involving law enforcement. Your clients are prepared to avoid prosecution, Wolfe corrected. There is a significant difference. However, I'm a practical man. Mr. Caro is alive and unharmed. The immediate crisis has passed. The question now is whether justice will be served through cooperation or through the more dramatic mechanism of criminal prosecution. He reached for his beer and drank slowly, his eyes moving from face to face. I propose the following arrangement. Your clients will provide complete restitution of the stolen funds, plus a substantial penalty payment to Morse and Associates for damages. The rotating wall mechanism will be dismantled immediately under independent supervision. In exchange, Mr. Morse will delay filing his report with federal prosecutors for 24 hours. Rostova laughed bitterly. You expect us to simply hand over $12 million? I expect you to choose between financial loss and extended incarceration, Wolfe replied. The evidence is overwhelming. The fraud will be exposed regardless of your cooperation. The only question is whether you face charges as defendants who stonewalled the investigation or as individuals who attempted to make amends for their crimes. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Whitman was calculating odds with the desperation of a man watching his career dissolve. Kovich sat with his head in his hands, finally understanding that his company's survival had been sacrificed the moment they agreed to build the mechanism. Rostova stared at the wall as if watching her carefully constructed identity evaporate. Finally, Whitman sighed, the sound of complete defeat. We'll need written agreements, guarantees about the scope of testimony, limits on additional charges. You'll have them, Wolfe said. Archie will coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office tonight. By morning, you'll have your agreements. In exchange, you will have surrendered completely and provided full cooperation. For the next hour, the office became a surreal parody of a business meeting. Whitman dictated terms while I typed, the keys clacking like gunshots in the quiet room. Bank transfers were arranged by telephone, with funds moving into escrow accounts controlled by Morse's attorneys. Technical schematics for dismantling the rotating wall were produced and examined. When the documents were signed and the financial arrangements verified, Wolfe rang for more beer. The tension had broken, replaced by the exhausted atmosphere that follows the resolution of a crisis. The mechanism will be dismantled tomorrow, Wolfe said as they prepared to leave. Mr. Morse will supervise the process personally. I trust there will be no further complications. As the conspirators filed out, defeated and diminished, Wolfe remained seated, his expression impassive. When the front door closed behind them, the silence that returned felt cleaner, as if a toxic presence had been purged from the brownstone. Well, I said, gathering the signed documents. That was efficient. We recovered the money, saved the client's partner, and even gave the bad guys time to arrange their affairs before facing justice. They will not flee, Wolfe observed, opening his book. Mr. Whitman is too ambitious to become a fugitive, and Miss Rostova too proud. They will use the time to construct defenses, to negotiate plea bargains, to blame subordinates. Justice will be served, Archie, but it will be the methodical justice of the courts, not the dramatic justice of the scaffold. David Caro looked up from examining his recovered wedding ring. Tomorrow I'm going to watch them tear down that wall. After that, I'm taking a very long vacation. Wolfe nodded approvingly. An excellent plan. Archie, check the orchids before retiring. The Cattleya Mossiae should be opening tonight, and I would regret missing the display. I headed for the elevator, leaving Nero Wolfe to his reading and his beer. The impossible disappearance had been explained, the conspiracy exposed, and justice arranged with characteristic precision. Just another evening's work for a genius who solved problems through pure intellectual force, and the assistant who made sure he occasionally left his chair to do it. The morning after the confrontation arrived with the kind of grey drizzle that makes October in Manhattan feel like a dress rehearsal for winter. I was at my desk sorting through the signed documents from the previous night when the phone rang. Fritz answered in the kitchen, and I could hear the progression of his tone from courteous to resigned to slightly exasperated, which meant Inspector Kramer was having one of his mornings. Kramer arrived 20 minutes later, tracking city moisture across Fritz's polished floor and radiating the particular brand of sour satisfaction that comes from knowing you've been deliberately excluded from something important. He dropped into the red leather chair like it had personally insulted his ancestors and fixed Wolfe with a stare that could have curdled fresh milk. "So," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I spend half the night getting briefed by federal agents about a kidnapping and fraud case that happened in my precinct, under my nose, involving a mechanism that makes the House of Mirrors look like amateur hour. You want to tell me why I'm reading about Nero Wolfe's latest miracle in an FBI report instead of hearing it from you?" Wolfe, who had descended from the plant rooms with his usual punctuality, settled behind his desk and reached for his beer. "Good morning, Inspector. You're experiencing the natural consequences of living in a federal system where jurisdiction follows the money rather than geography. The conspiracy involved interstate commerce, federal contracts, and systematic fraud. Your satisfaction should derive from the absence of corpses requiring your immediate attention." "That's not the point," Kramer growled, pulling out a cigar and biting the end with unnecessary violence. "You had a man vanish from a concrete tube, and you didn't think to mention it until the case was wrapped and delivered to the U.S. attorney with a bow on top." "Inspector," Wolfe said mildly, "the people responsible for Mr. Caro's disappearance had demonstrated their ability to manipulate official channels. They controlled witnesses, evidence, even security footage. Involving you prematurely would have supplied them with the leverage they sought to exploit. I prefer to call you when interference is impossible and success no longer depends on secrecy." Kramer's expression suggested he was calculating whether strangling Wolfe would be worth the paperwork. "You mean when I can't mess up your game?" "I mean when your presence contributes to justice rather than chaos," Wolfe replied. "Today you may examine evidence, file reports, and coordinate with federal authorities. Last night, your procedural enthusiasm might have gotten Mr. Caro killed." The fight went out of Kramer like air from a punctured tire. He sagged back in his chair, rubbing his nose in that familiar gesture of grudging acceptance. "Yeah, maybe. The feds said the same thing. Still burns, though. You know what it's like hearing some engineering hotshot describe that rotating wall and realizing it was built with city permits? I spent the next hour giving Kramer the complete technical briefing. The laser measurements that revealed the corridor's dimensional variance, the oil residue that proved mechanical operation, the rubber seals that concealed the pivot points, the hydraulic system hidden in the service ceiling. By the time I finished, his cigar had burned down to an inch of ash, held together by determination and spite. "The mechanism is being dismantled this morning," I told him. "Federal supervision, complete documentation. If you want to see it before it becomes evidence bags, you'd better move fast." After Kramer departed with copies of everything that wasn't nailed down, I took a taxi to the construction site. The scene had transformed overnight from a place of secrets to a carnival of official scrutiny. FBI vehicles, police cars, and engineering trucks filled the area around Section C, where a specialized demolition crew was methodically taking apart the impossible corridor. David Caro was there, watching the destruction of his prison with the intense focus of a man witnessing the end of a nightmare. Gerald Morse stood beside him, both men wearing the slightly shell-shocked expressions of people who had survived something that shouldn't have been survivable. "It looks so ordinary now," Caro said as I joined them. "Just metal and hydraulics. Hard to believe I was terrified of it." The demolition crew had exposed the rotating mechanism in all its elaborate complexity. The wall section was mounted on precision bearings that belonged in aircraft assembly, powered by hydraulic cylinders designed for stage machinery. The control system used industrial components built for fail-safe operation. The entire device represented an investment of at least $200,000, all to create a machine whose sole purpose was making inconvenient people disappear. "Whoever designed this knew their business," the chief engineer told me, photographing the mechanism from multiple angles. "This isn't improvised work. The hydraulic cylinder is custom manufactured by a company that builds stage equipment for Broadway theaters. They're cooperating with investigators, and their records show the order came from a shell company traced to North Line Capital." By noon, the mechanism had been completely disassembled, its components tagged and loaded into evidence trucks. The corridor looked violated, with a ragged hole where the rotating section had been and exposed utility spaces visible behind the damaged concrete. Workers were already preparing to fill the gap with solid concrete, erasing the physical evidence while preserving every detail in photographs and technical drawings. We returned to the brownstone for lunch, where Fritz had prepared roasted duck with olives and a gratin that made you question every meal you'd eaten previously. Wolfe enforced his customary silence during the meal, treating digestion as a sacred ritual that shouldn't be interrupted by conversation about rotating walls or federal investigations. Over coffee in the office afterward, Wolfe finally allowed himself a moment of philosophical reflection. "The rotating wall," he murmured, "is an ancient device, really. The Greeks used periaktoi in their theaters to change scenes instantly. Elizabethan manor houses employed similar principles for priest holes. Mr. Whitman and his associates merely updated the technology with modern hydraulics." "It was the audacity that made it work," Caro observed, "building it into public infrastructure, right under everyone's noses." "Audacity is often mistaken for genius," Wolfe corrected, "but they are distinct qualities. Genius anticipates failure. Audacity ignores it. Their plan relied on absolute control over variables they could not possibly control. Your reaction to captivity, Mr. Morse's reaction to threats, and ultimately, my reaction to an intellectual puzzle." He reached for the bank receipt Morse had placed on his desk that morning, confirming the restitution payments had cleared. "You have your partner restored, Mr. Morse. You have your project's integrity preserved. The people who attempted to destroy both are facing federal prosecution. I trust this concludes our business satisfactorily." After the clients departed, the brownstone settled back into its customary rhythm. The case files were updated and filed, the impossible crime reduced to documentation and evidence. I sat at my desk, reflecting on how a man who never left his chair had orchestrated the destruction of an elaborate criminal conspiracy through nothing more than patient observation and relentless logic. "You know," I said to Wolfe, who was examining his globe with the satisfied air of a man whose world had been properly arranged, "they really thought they had built the perfect crime. A machine that could make witnesses disappear without a trace. Perfect crimes exist only in the imagination of imperfect criminals," Wolfe replied, moving toward his desk. "They forgot that truth has a persistent habit of asserting itself, usually at the most inconvenient moment possible." He rang for beer, the signal that normal life had resumed, and the case was officially history. Outside, the October afternoon was clearing, leaving the city washed and gleaming under breaking clouds. Somewhere in federal custody, 3 conspirators were learning that building machines to manipulate reality was considerably easier than avoiding the consequences of using them. "The check cleared?" Wolfe asked, settling into his chair. "This morning, enough to keep us comfortable through winter, assuming you don't discover any orchids that cost more than luxury automobiles. Fritz informs me that Shad Row has increased in price again," Wolfe observed, opening his book. "Orchids, fortunately, remain reasonable." I smiled at the window, watching traffic navigate the wet streets. The man from 35th Junction wasn't missing anymore, and neither was the satisfaction that comes from watching impossible crimes become inevitable justice. In the brownstone, that was as close to a standing ovation as anyone ever received. The morning papers arrived with the subtlety of a brass band, which is to say, they made enough noise to wake the dead and probably annoyed them considerably. The headlines ranged from the Gazette's relatively restrained "Engineering Conspiracy Exposed" to the tabloid's more colorful "Tunnel of Terror Destroyed," complete with photographs of the dismantled rotating wall that made it look like something from a mad scientist's laboratory. Wolfe read the coverage over breakfast with the detached interest of a man observing the mating habits of insects, occasionally grunting his disapproval at particularly egregious distortions of fact. "They have reduced a sophisticated financial conspiracy to sensational mechanics," he observed, folding the paper with distaste. "The rotating wall photographs well, therefore it becomes the entire story. The systematic theft of $12 million merits 3 paragraphs buried on page 4. The wall is more interesting," I pointed out. "People understand machines that eat people. Embezzlement is just numbers moving around on paper. Precisely why the scheme succeeded as long as it did. The audacity of the mechanism distracted from the mundane criminality it served." By Wednesday, the legal machinery had ground into motion with its characteristic blend of efficiency and theater. Charles Whitman, demonstrating the survival instincts that had made him a successful corporate attorney, negotiated himself into partial immunity in exchange for complete cooperation. Elena Rostova, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in federal prison, accepted a plea agreement for 15 years with possibility of parole. Leo Kovich, who had built the mechanism with his own hands, received 20 years for kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy, with no early release provision. The news reached us via telephone from the U.S. Attorney's Office, delivered by a prosecutor who sounded simultaneously exhausted and triumphant. Wolfe listened without comment, thanked the caller with perfunctory courtesy, and returned to his book as if justice achieved was merely another administrative detail requiring acknowledgement. Thursday afternoon brought Inspector Kramer to the office, wearing his usual expression of grudging respect mixed with professional irritation. He settled into the red leather chair like a man preparing for minor surgery, and fixed Wolfe with a stare that could have curdled fresh milk. "You'll be pleased to know," he announced without preamble, "that your friends from Northline Capital are now experiencing the city's hospitality at closer quarters than they'd prefer. The U.S. Attorney is very pleased with himself. The Commissioner is pretending he knew everything from the start, and I'm told to convey their official appreciation." "Unnecessary and unwelcome," Wolfe replied, not looking up from his book. "That's what I told them, more or less. But here's what sticks with me, Wolfe. You had a man disappear from a sealed corridor, tracked him to a basement nobody knew existed, and got him back alive with nobody shot and no bodies requiring my attention. That's not your usual style. On the contrary, it is precisely my style. If you have observed something different, the error lies in your classification system." Friday morning brought a phone call that made Wolfe's eyebrows rise a fraction of an inch, which in his vocabulary constituted dramatic surprise. District Attorney Skinner was on the line, his voice carrying the particular edge that suggested someone had questioned his authority and lived to regret it. "Wolfe," Skinner's voice filled the office through the speaker. I want to know by what authority you negotiated a 24-hour delay in reporting a felony of this magnitude. Whitman's lawyers are already claiming his surrender was a voluntary act of civic virtue." "Mr. Skinner," Wolfe replied, his tone dropping to combat the volume from the other end, "I negotiated nothing. I merely informed Mr. Whitman that evidence would be presented to authorities at a specific time. If he chose to use the intervening hours to arrange his surrender and prepare a confession, that demonstrates legal prudence, not conspiracy on my part. You accepted restitution in exchange for silence. I accepted restitution for my client. The silence was temporary and strategic. Had we involved police immediately, Mr. Whitman would have destroyed evidence, Mr. Kovich would have fled, and Miss Rostova would have vanished into North Line's corporate labyrinth. Instead, you have 3 defendants in custody, signed confessions, and irrefutable physical evidence. You have a perfect case, sir. Stop complaining about the wrapping and accept the gift." After a pause, Skinner's voice returned at normal volume. "Whitman is trying to roll over on everyone. Claims he was just legal counsel and Rostova was the mastermind. He is lying. Check his bank records for a shell company named Daedalus Holdings. You will find the initial payments for hydraulic design work originated there. Daedalus, the labyrinth builder. Cute." The line went dead. Later that afternoon, Saul Panzer delivered disturbing news. The FBI had discovered evidence that the mechanism had been used at least twice before Caro's disappearance. A union organizer 18 months earlier, and a city inspector who had questioned material quality standards. Both cases had been written off as people who left town voluntarily. Whitman provided the complete timeline, Saul reported. Names, dates, everything. Making people disappear was their standard solution to problems that couldn't be solved with money or legal intimidation. Wolfe sat silent for several minutes, arranging this information into its proper philosophical framework. The mechanism was not an emergency measure, he concluded finally. It was standard operating procedure. They built a machine for eliminating obstacles and used it with the casual efficiency of people disposing of refuse. That transforms this from an isolated crime into a systematic program of terror. The additional victims mean additional charges, I observed, and additional years in prison, which will satisfy society's need for proportional punishment. But it raises a disturbing question. How many other such mechanisms exist in our city's infrastructure, built by other conspirators, waiting for other inconvenient people? The weekend brought a letter from David Caro, written from his new office at Columbia University. He described his first week teaching structural engineering, the eager students, the satisfaction of working with minds not yet corrupted by compromise. He closed with an observation that Wolfe read aloud over dinner. "You told me impossible crimes exist only in the imagination of imperfect criminals. I'm teaching my students that impossible structures exist only in the imagination of imperfect engineers. Perhaps between us, we can create a generation that builds honestly and thinks clearly." Wolfe set down the letter and reached for his wine. An optimistic sentiment, though history suggests otherwise. But optimism in the face of evidence is perhaps the most human quality we possess. Monday afternoon, as I was organizing the case files for permanent storage, Wolfe looked up from his examination of the globe on his desk. "The tragedy of people like Miss Rostova," he observed, "is not that they fail, but that they succeed just enough to believe they are infallible. The rotating wall was a masterpiece of engineering, Archie. Had they applied that ingenuity to legitimate purposes, they might have revolutionized urban transit. Instead, they used it to construct a trap, and inevitably caught themselves in it." "Speaking of traps," I said, "the next time someone builds a wall that eats people, I vote we call the police before we call the newspapers." "An excellent policy," Wolfe agreed, returning to his book. "I find I have developed a distaste for architectural magic tricks." The case files went into the cabinet marked "Closed, Satisfactory Resolution," joining the accumulated evidence of other impossible crimes that had turned out to be merely improbable ones wearing elaborate disguises. Outside, the October afternoon was settling into evening, and in the brownstone, order had been restored to a small corner of the universe. The man from 35th Junction was no longer missing. The machine that swallowed him was scrap metal in evidence lockers, and justice had been served with the methodical precision that Nero Wolfe brought to all his endeavors. It was, I reflected as I headed to the kitchen for dinner, exactly how these things should end, with the guilty punished, the innocent restored, and the impossible explained. In the world of Nero Wolfe, that constituted a very satisfactory conclusion indeed. The evening settled over the brownstone with the particular quality of peace that follows the resolution of chaos, like the silence after a thunderstorm when the air itself seems cleaner. I was at my desk, filing the last documents from the Caro case, when the aroma from Fritz's kitchen announced that dinner would be something special. The scent of roasting duck and reducing wine suggested he was making amends for a week of disrupted schedules and irregular meals. When Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at 7:30, his expression carried the satisfaction of a man whose world had been properly rearranged. We moved to the dining room, where Fritz had outdone himself with caneton aux cerises, the duck glazed to perfection and accompanied by a sauce that spoke of hours of patient reduction. For 40 minutes, the only sounds were the civilized clicking of silver against china and Wolfe's occasional murmurs of appreciation. It wasn't until the cheese course that conversation became possible. Wolfe sliced his Roquefort with surgical precision and fixed me with the look that meant he had been thinking about something and wanted my opinion extracted for examination. "What troubles you about the resolution, Archie?" I'd been hoping he wouldn't notice, but Wolfe notices everything, especially when I'm trying not to think about something. "It's Rostova," I admitted. "She gets 15 years, and I keep thinking about what a waste it is. She had the brains to build something remarkable, and she used them to make people disappear. You're experiencing belated sympathy for a criminal." "Not sympathy exactly. More like regret. If she had aimed that intelligence in a different direction, she could have been designing bridges instead of building traps." Wolfe poured wine with his customary care. "Ability divorced from conscience, Archie, is merely potential energy seeking an outlet. The outlet Miss Rostova selected was theft and intimidation. Your regret dishonors her victims." "I know that. But she wasn't some street thug grabbing purses. She understood exactly what she was doing, right down to the engineering tolerances. That makes it worse somehow." "Precisely why she deserves condemnation rather than pity," Wolfe replied. "Intelligence without morality is not a tragedy, it is a weapon. Miss Rostova built a machine to erase inconvenient people because she could, not because she had to. That is the essential corruption of the educated criminal." He leaned back, his eyes half closed in the way that meant he was arranging thoughts into their proper philosophical framework. "Consider the contrast, Archie. Fritz spends his days creating things that affirm existence, flavors, textures, sensations that make life richer. Miss Rostova and her associates spent months constructing a device whose sole purpose was negation, the mechanical removal of human presence from the world. The difference between building up and tearing down. The difference between creation and erasure. They treated Mr. Caro as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be reckoned with. It is the ultimate expression of arrogance, the belief that other people are merely obstacles to be mechanically removed." After dinner, we returned to the office with coffee, where the evening mail had brought a letter from Gerald Morse. The 35th Junction project was proceeding under new management with independent oversight and financial controls that would make future embezzlement considerably more difficult. David Caro had been retained as chief consulting engineer and was already working on redesigning Section C with solid concrete walls and no moving parts. "A satisfactory outcome," Wolfe observed, setting down the letter. "The project continues, the criminals face justice, and the mechanism has been reduced to evidence in federal storage. Order restored through the application of logic and persistence. And what about the other victims? The union organizer and the inspector who disappeared before Caro. Inspector Kramer has the evidence and the authority to pursue those cases if he chooses. My interest was in Mr. Caro's specific disappearance, which has been resolved. I cannot chase every injustice in this city, Archie. That would be an inefficient allocation of my time and abilities. It was vintage Wolfe logic, morally defensible and practically sound, even if it left loose ends dangling. But he was right. We had saved the client, exposed the conspiracy, and destroyed the machine. The rest was up to the authorities, who had the manpower and jurisdiction to handle it properly. The phone rang once more, but I let it go to Fritz. After a moment, he appeared in the doorway. A gentleman asking if Mr. Wolfe investigates missing persons near construction sites. I told him the office was closed for the evening. Tell anyone else who calls that we are not accepting cases involving architectural anomalies, Wolfe instructed. I have no desire to become the city's unofficial expert on disappearing walls and mechanical mysteries. As the evening wound down, Wolfe prepared for his nightly visit to the orchids while I locked up the office. The case files went into their proper drawer, the impossible crime reduced to documentation and memory. Through the windows, Manhattan hummed with its usual energy, indifferent to individual triumphs and tragedies. You know, I said as Wolfe headed for the elevator, they really thought they had built the perfect crime, a machine that could make witnesses vanish without a trace. Perfect crimes exist only in the imagination of imperfect criminals, he replied. They forgot that truth has a persistent habit of asserting itself, usually at the most inconvenient moment possible. The elevator carried him up to a sanctuary among the orchids, where the air was humid and warm, and nothing more threatening than aphids disturbed the peace. I finished my final checks and turned off the office lights, leaving the brownstone to settle into its nightly rhythm. Walking up the stairs to my room, I reflected on the week's work. Another impossible crime explained through patient logic. Another conspiracy exposed through systematic investigation. The man who had vanished from 35th Junction was safe. The machine that swallowed him was scrap metal in evidence lockers, and justice had been served with the methodical precision that Nero Wolfe brought to all his endeavors. It was, I thought as I reached the second floor, exactly how these things should end. With the guilty punished, the innocent restored, and the impossible revealed as merely improbable. In the world of Nero Wolfe, that constituted a very satisfactory conclusion indeed. The wall was gone, the mystery was solved, and tomorrow the orchids would still be blooming in their climate-controlled paradise, proof that some things in this world remain exactly where they belong. The morning after the mechanism's destruction arrived with the kind of November clarity that makes Manhattan look deceptively innocent, all clean lines and honest shadows. I was at my desk endorsing a check from Gerald Morse that was substantial enough to keep Wolfe in orchids and beer through the winter, when Fritz announced a visitor who hadn't bothered with appointments or preliminary phone calls. David Caro entered the office looking like a man who had been reassembled from better parts. The bruises had faded to yellow memories, but the real change was deeper. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that solid ground could betray you without warning. When Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at 11, Caro was sitting in the red leather chair, turning his wedding ring with nervous fingers. "Mr. Caro," Wolfe said, settling behind his desk with his customary precision. "You appear to have survived your ordeal with your faculties intact. I trust you have come with purpose rather than redundant gratitude." Caro smiled for the first time since I had known him. Both, actually. But mostly I needed to understand something. The silence. How could a wall of concrete move and swallow a man without making a sound? It's been keeping me awake. Wolfe poured beer with methodical care, creating the perfect head. "Physics, Mr. Caro. High-pressure hydraulic systems operate with fluid efficiency when properly maintained. The mechanism was mounted on precision bearings, sealed with mass-loaded vinyl, and operated within acoustic isolation parameters. The sound you expected was engineered out of existence. He explained the technical details with clinical precision, reducing nightmare to mechanics. I watched the tension drain from Caro's shoulders as Wolfe transformed his monster into a machine. When the explanation concluded, Caro sat straighter, his engineer's mind finally able to process what had happened to him in rational terms. "There's something else," Caro continued, his voice steadier now. "The FBI called yesterday. Your investigation opened something much larger than any of us realized." Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Elaborate." "They found evidence of 17 similar mechanisms built into infrastructure projects across 6 states over the past decade. Rotating walls, collapsible floors, false ceilings. All designed by shell companies connected to Northline Capital, all funded through the same network we exposed." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Wolfe set down his glass with deliberate precision. "They industrialized disappearance." "Exactly. The FBI believes at least 9 people vanished through these mechanisms before anyone recognized the pattern. Union organizers, safety inspectors, auditors. Anyone who threatened their operations simply ceased to exist." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. 9 people written off as voluntary departures or simple runaways. The scope transforms this from isolated crime into systematic evil, Wolfe observed, his voice carrying an edge I rarely heard. "They created infrastructure for human erasure, Mr. Caro. It is the ultimate corruption of engineering principles." Caro nodded grimly. "Whitman is providing complete cooperation now, mapping every location, every technical specification. The dismantling process will take months, but they'll find everyone. He's also revealed the financial structure. $47 million stolen across all projects, with the mechanisms serving as both theft enabler and witness elimination system." The phone rang, interrupting our discussion. Inspector Kramer was calling with his final report on the other victims from our case. The union organizer and city inspector had been found where Wolfe predicted, in a defunct foundation, caisson beneath the Northline Annex building. Not a happy ending, but closure for their families. After I relayed this information, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence. When he spoke, his tone carried philosophical weight. The tragedy of Miss Rostova and her associates was not their criminality, but their waste. They possessed minds capable of genuine achievement. Instead, they applied their intelligence to the architecture of erasure. "The FBI offered me a position," Caro said quietly. "Chief Safety Inspector for Hidden Infrastructure. My job would be reviewing major construction projects, looking for similar mechanisms. If they exist, I'll find them." "You have transformed victimization into expertise," Wolfe observed approvingly. "An admirable response to trauma. I learned from the best. You taught me that impossible circumstances require methodical investigation. When they held me in that basement, I spent 3 days studying the room's construction, memorizing details, preparing to testify. I knew someone would come looking." After Caro departed, walking with renewed confidence, the office settled into its customary rhythm. I filed the final documents, moving the 35th Junction case into the permanent archives. The impossible crime had become inevitable justice, filed between corporate espionage and a disputed inheritance. Inspector Kramer arrived during lunch, trailing cigar smoke and bureaucratic weariness. He dropped a thick file on Wolfe's desk without ceremony. "Final accounting," he announced. 17 mechanisms, 9 victims, $47 million in theft. The U.S. Attorney says it's the largest infrastructure fraud case in federal history. The scale was ambitious, Wolfe acknowledged. They built a national network for making inconvenient people disappear. "How did you know?" Kramer demanded. "Not guess, but know there were other victims." Wolfe leaned back, fingers interlaced. Economics, Inspector. A mechanism as expensive and sophisticated as the rotating wall is never built for single use. It represents substantial investment, and investments demand returns. The existence of the machine implied a history of the machine. Kramer chewed his cigar to a ragged stump, nodded grudgingly, and departed without thanks. He never thanked us directly, but his presence confirmed that justice had been served with proper thoroughness. The afternoon brought administrative peace. I completed the final expense accounting, deposited Morse's check, and organized the evidence files. At 4 o'clock, Wolfe closed his book and fixed me with a contemplative stare. The corruption of intelligence is a greater sin than the corruption of morals. Archie, a thug who breaks a nose is merely brutal. An engineer who designs machines to vanish human beings commits crimes against civilization itself. They were just crooks with slide rules, I argued. They were architects of erasure, Wolfe corrected. They possessed the tools of progress and used them to serve the principles of negation. That is the essential tragedy of the educated criminal. As evening settled over the brownstone, Fritz announced that dinner would be ready shortly. Wolfe rose from his chair, preparing for his final visit to the orchids before the meal. At the office door, he paused and looked back at the red leather chair where so many clients had brought their troubles. In a world of shifting walls and hidden traps, he observed, it is satisfactory to maintain a place where the floor is solid and the truth is inevitable. He ascended to his plants, leaving me to lock up the office. Outside, November darkness was settling over Manhattan, and somewhere in the city, 17 mechanisms were being systematically dismantled by engineers who now knew what to look for. The man from 35th Junction was no longer missing. The machine that swallowed him was scrap metal in evidence lockers, and justice had been served with the methodical precision that characterized all of Nero Wolfe's investigations. I turned off the lights and headed for dinner, reflecting that in the world of Nero Wolfe, impossible crimes always became inevitable explanations, and truth always asserted itself against even the most elaborate mechanical deceptions. It was, I thought as I climbed the stairs, exactly how these things should end.